Open a 1976 pantry door. Go ahead. Imagine the hinge creaking, the smell of cardboard and corn syrup, the avocado green shelf liner curling at the corners. Now reach for the boxes, the bottles, the tins, and read the labels out loud. Some of those ingredients are still on shelves today, only under different names, at different dosages, with different warning requirements. Others vanished completely. A few were pulled by federal order. A few were reformulated so quietly that most shoppers never noticed the change. And some were studied for decades before regulators decided finally to take action. The 1970s pantry is a time capsule, and the stories behind each label tell you almost everything you need to know about how modern American food law actually works. Today, we are going to walk through that pantry, shelf by shelf, label by label. We are going to look at the specific ingredients that defined processed food in the mid-1970s and follow each one forward in time, to the congressional hearing, to the FDA notice, to the reformulation memo, to the grocery aisle of today. This is not a story about villains. It is a story about a regulatory system that moves slowly, argues publicly, and eventually, sometimes decades later, arrives at a decision. So pull up a chair, open the pantry, let us read the labels together. Before we pick up the first box, picture the kitchen around it. The year is 1906. The country has just finished its bicentennial celebrations. The Ford administration is in its final months. The FDA is run by a physician named Alexander Schmidt, a calm, measured commissioner who inherited an agency still rebuilding its credibility after the turbulent late 1960s. His predecessor, Dr. Herbert Lay, had been pushed out years earlier after publicly criticizing industry influence. A young lawyer named Peter Barton Hutt had served as FDA chief counsel from 1971 to 1975, quietly rewriting the rules for food labeling. Outside the agency, consumer advocates were demanding attention. Ralph Nader had already reshaped auto safety and was turning his attention to food. Michael Jacobson had founded the Center for Science in the Public Interest in 1971. A former breakfast cereal critic named Robert Choate had testified before Congress about empty-calorie cereals marketed to children. The pantry you are about to open exists inside that political weather. Every ingredient on every label has a file folder somewhere in Washington, and in many of those folders, someone is already preparing a petition, a hearing, or a lawsuit. Let us begin. The first thing you notice, reaching for the top shelf, is color. Bright, saturated, almost cartoonish color. The 1976 pantry is a color-drenched environment, and most of that color did not come from fruit. The first box your hand lands on is a canister of powdered drink mix, strawberry-flavored. The label lists, near the top, the ingredient red dye number 2. By 1976, that ingredient is on borrowed time. Red number 2, chemically known as amaranth, had been in American food since the early 20th century. It was the dominant red colorant in the country, used in sausage casings, candy coatings, ice cream, soft drinks, and cosmetics. In the early 1970s, Soviet researchers published studies suggesting a possible link between amaranth and tumors in lab rats. The FDA reviewed the studies, ran its own, and in January 1976, under Commissioner Schmidt, formally banned red number 2 from the American food supply. The ban did not mean the dye was proven dangerous beyond question. It meant the agency could not confirm its safety at the levels being consumed. That distinction matters. Under the 1958 Delaney Clause, any food additive shown to cause cancer in humans or animals had to be removed. Red number 2 was not proven to cause cancer. It was simply no longer proven safe. The FDA chose caution. Manufacturers reformulated. Most of them switched to red Noxo 40, a dye that had been approved in 1971 and remains in wide use today. Pattern interrupt. Put the canister back. If you lived through the 1970s, you probably remember the unique synthetic strawberry tang of Nestlé Quick Powder, that aggressive, slightly chemical sweetness that did not resemble any actual strawberry you had ever eaten. That flavor was the 1970s. It was also, in most households, the taste of a specific dye-plus flavor combination that was about to change forever. When Red No. 2 was pulled, a lot of pink products went briefly beige while chemists scrambled to match the old shade with the new dye. Some kids noticed, most did not. That is how the American food supply usually changes. Quietly, one reformulation at a time. Reach for the next shelf. Your fingers close on a small glass bottle of artificial sweetener tablets. The label reads saccharin. This is the second label in our time capsule, and it carries one of the most important stories in American food regulation. Saccharin had been discovered in 1879 and used as a sweetener for nearly a century. It had survived Theodore Roosevelt himself, who famously defended it against his own chief food safety chemist. But in 1977, 1 year after our pantry visit, Canadian researchers reported that high doses of saccharin caused bladder tumors in male rats. Under the Delaney Clause, the FDA moved to ban it. The public reaction was immediate and unusual. Saccharin was the only game in town for diabetics and dieters. Cyclamate, the other major artificial sweetener, had already been banned in 1969. Consumers flooded Congress with mail. Legislators responded by passing the Saccharin Study and Labeling Act in November 1977, which imposed a moratorium on the ban and required a warning label on every saccharin-containing product. That warning: use of this product may be hazardous to your health. This product contains saccharin, which has been determined to cause cancer in laboratory animals. Appeared on pink packets and diet sodas from 1977 until the moratorium was finally lifted and the label removed in 2000, after later studies found the rat-specific mechanism did not apply to humans in the same way. The saccharin story is the textbook example of how American food law can move, pause, reconsider, and unwind itself over decades. Keep reading labels. The next bottle on the shelf is a Diet Cola, Tab most likely, in its iconic pink can. Tab in 1976 sweetened itself with saccharin, since cyclamate was already gone. Cyclamate had been banned by the FDA in October 1969 after studies linked a cyclamate-saccharin blend to bladder tumors in rats. The cyclamate ban pulled an entire generation of diet drinks off the shelf overnight. Manufacturers reformulated around saccharin, and the metallic aftertaste of 1970s Tab was the taste of that forced switch. Cyclamate was never reapproved in the United States, though it remains legal in dozens of other countries, including Canada, where it is sold as Succaril. The sweetener aisle of the 1976 pantry is a narrow one: saccharin and sugar. That is essentially the whole list. Pattern interrupt. Picture the marketing around these products. In 1976, a diet soda was still a niche item, sold mostly to women, marketed with glamour rather than science, and consumed in far smaller volumes than today. The pantry you are standing in probably has one bottle of Tab, maybe one canister of Sweet and Low packets, and a very large bag of actual granulated sugar. Scale matters. The regulatory debates of the 1970s were shaped by the consumption patterns of the 1970s, not ours. Back to the shelves. Move down one row. Here is a box of breakfast cereal. Flip it sideways and read the fine print. Halfway through the ingredient list, you will find two small acronyms: BHA and BHT, butylated hydroxyanisole and butylated hydroxytoluene. These are preservatives, antioxidants, added to prevent fats and oils from going rancid. They were approved by the FDA in the 1940s and 1950s, and in 1976, they were classified as GRAS, generally recognized as safe. They still are today for most uses, but they have been studied intensely for decades. Some animal studies have raised questions about tumor formation at very high doses. Other studies have found potential antioxidant benefits. The scientific picture has stayed genuinely unsettled, which is why you will still find BHA and BHT on American labels today, and also why you will find many major brands that have voluntarily removed them. Kellogg's, General Mills, and Post all reformulated a number of cereals in the 2010s to remove BHT, not because regulators required it, but because consumers asked. The 976 box in your hand, though, that one has both. Often listed as BHA and BHT added to packaging to preserve freshness, a phrase that became almost invisible through repetition. Next shelf, canned goods. Pull down a tin of Spam, a package of bacon, a jar of hot dogs in brine. Somewhere on every one of these labels, you will see sodium nitrite, sodium nitrate, or both. These are curing agents used for centuries in one form or another. Saltpeter, the traditional name for potassium nitrate, is documented in medieval recipes. In modern processed meat, nitrite prevents the growth of Clostridium botulinum, fixes the pink color of ham, bacon, and hot dogs, and contributes to the distinctive cured flavor. Nitrites were controversial in the 1970s for a specific reason. Under high heat, they can form compounds called nitrosamines, some of which are carcinogenic in animal studies. The USDA and FDA responded in the mid-1970s by lowering allowable nitrite levels and requiring the addition of ascorbic acid or erythorbate to cured meats, which inhibits nitrosamine formation. Those rules are still in force. Nitrites remain legal. The rise of uncured bacon, labeled as containing celery powder, is, chemically, often the same story in different words, because celery powder is naturally high in nitrates that convert to nitrite during curing. Pattern interrupt. If you are wondering why the regulatory system keeps so many ingredients in a holding pattern rather than banning them outright, the answer is in the statute. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires the FDA to weigh risk against benefit, with specific procedures for each category of additive. Some are GRAS, some are approved food additives, some are color additives, under a separate certification system, and some are covered by special clauses like Delaney. A ban is not a switch a commissioner flips. It is a rulemaking process that can take years, generate thousands of pages of comment, and end up in federal court. Back to the pantry. Move to the oils and shortenings. Pull down a can of Crisco. Pull down a stick of margarine. Read the ingredients. You will see a phrase that appears on almost every processed food in the 1976 pantry: partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. These oils were the workhorse fat of 20th century American food. Cheap, shelf-stable, solid at room temperature. They were in margarine, shortening, cookies, crackers, frozen pot pies, microwave popcorn, fast food fryer oil. They also contained trans fats. The connection between trans fats and cardiovascular disease began to be documented in the 1980s and 1990s, and by the early 2000s, the evidence was strong enough that the FDA required trans fat disclosure on nutrition labels starting in 2006. In 2015, the FDA determined that partially hydrogenated oils were no longer generally recognized as safe. The final federal ban on most uses took effect in 2018. The 1976 pantry is a museum of these oils. The taste of 1970s processed baked goods, the soft, slightly waxy mouthfeel of a Hostess cupcake frosting, the plasticky sheen of Kool-Aid-era icing, is the taste of trans fats in their commercial prime. Next shelf, soft drinks, and not just diet soft drinks. A regular bottle of soda in 1976 was sweetened with sucrose corn sugar, or a newer sweetener that had just begun its commercial rise. High-fructose corn syrup had been developed in the late 1950s and commercialized between 1967 and 1970 through industrial enzyme processes refined by researchers working for companies like Clinton Corn Processing and later Archer Daniels Midland. By 1976, HFCS was just starting to replace cane and beet sugar in American soft drinks. Coca-Cola and PepsiCo would complete the full switch to HFCS in their domestic formulas by 1984. HFCS has never been banned. It has never been declared unsafe by the FDA. What has happened is a long, slow public argument about whether HFCS contributes to metabolic problems in ways different from or similar to regular sugar. The current scientific consensus, broadly, is that HFCS and sucrose produce comparable metabolic effects at similar caloric loads, but that both should be consumed in moderation. The 1976 pantry sits at the precise moment HFCS begins its takeover. A Coke in January 1976 still tastes mostly of cane sugar. A Coke in January 1986 tastes entirely of corn. Pattern interrupt. Notice something about the stories so far. Red number 2 was banned. Cyclamate was banned. Saccharin was almost banned, then warned, then unwarned. BHA and BHT remain legal and debated. Nitrites were restricted but kept. Trans fats took 40 years to remove. HFCS was never removed at all. The pattern is not a moral pattern, it is a regulatory pattern. The FDA acts when evidence crosses a specific legal threshold, or when Congress forces its hand, or when consumer pressure reshapes what safe means in practice. Reach for the bread, squeeze the loaf, read the ingredient panel. In 1976, most commercial American bread contained a dough conditioner called potassium bromate. Potassium bromate strengthens the gluten network and improves the rise and texture of mass-produced bread. It has been used in American baking since the 1910s. It is also classified as a possible human carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. The European Union banned potassium bromate in food in 1990. The United Kingdom banned it in 1990. Canada banned it in 1994. China banned it in 2005. The United States, as of today, has not banned it federally. California passed a state-level ban in 2023 that takes effect in 2027, part of a package of state food additive reforms. Most national baking brands in the U.S. voluntarily phased out bromate years ago, and most supermarket bread in 2026 is bromate-free. But the federal regulatory picture has not changed. A 1976 American bread label could list potassium bromate openly. A 1976 British bread label could too. The two countries diverged in 1990, and the United States has still not caught up. Right next to the bread is a box of crackers. Read that label too. You will likely find propyl gallate, another antioxidant preservative, sometimes paired with BHA and BHT. Propyl gallate was approved for American food in 1948 and remains on the GRAS list. Like the other phenolic antioxidants, it has been studied for possible endocrine effects, and like them, it has not reached the evidentiary threshold for a ban. Many manufacturers have removed it voluntarily because shorter ingredient lists sell better in the 2020s than they did in the 1970s. In 2026, it is a legacy ingredient that persists mostly in industrial food applications. Back to the color shelf. The 1976 pantry is full of other synthetic colors, and their stories are just as tangled. Red number 3, or erythrocene, was the bright pink-red dye used in maraschino cherries, candy, and baked goods. The FDA banned red number 3 for use in cosmetics and topical drugs in 1990 after evidence of thyroid tumors in male rats. For food use, though, red number 3 remained legal in the United States until January 2025. when the FDA finally revoked its food authorization with a compliance deadline in 2027. That is a 35-year gap between the cosmetic ban and the food ban for the same dye on the same chemistry. Red number 40 replaced red number 2 in 1976 and remains the most widely used red dye in American food today. It has been studied extensively, particularly for possible links to hyperactivity in children, and remains legal federally. Yellow number 5 tartrazine is the bright lemon yellow dye in Kool-Aid, mustard, boxed macaroni and cheese, and countless candies. In 1986, the FDA began requiring that products containing yellow no. 5 specifically list it by name on the label because a small subset of the population, particularly those with aspirin allergies, can experience sensitivity reactions. Yellow number 5 remains legal. Yellow number 6, blue number 1, and blue number 2 went through similar review cycles and all remain approved. The 1976 pantry glows with all of them. Pattern interrupt. Picture the artificial butter yellow on a stick of margarine, or the bright orange powder clinging to the inside of a Kraft macaroni and cheese pouch, or the saturated pink of a strawberry Pop-Tart filling. Those shades are chemistry, not fruit. The regulatory questions around synthetic color are almost never about whether a dye is acutely dangerous. They are about long-term, low-dose population-level effects, which is the hardest category of question any food safety agency has to answer. Move to the citrus shelf. Pull down a bottle of Sunkist, Mountain Dew, or Fresca. In 1976, most bright citrus sodas contained a stabilizer called brominated vegetable oil, or BVO, added in tiny quantities to keep the citrus flavor oil suspended in the water-based soda rather than floating to the top. BVO had been used since the 1930s. It was approved on an interim basis by the FDA in 1970, a temporary status that remained in place for more than 50 years. Studies raised questions about bromine accumulation in human tissue. Some manufacturers quietly reformulated. Gatorade removed BVO in 2013, Coca-Cola and PepsiCo by 2014. Finally, in July 2024, the FDA formally revoked the authorization of BVO as a food additive. The ban was paperwork catching up to a reformulation industry had already done. Next shelf, dry soup mix, bouillon cubes, a canister of seasoning salt. Read the ingredients. You will see MSG, monosodium glutamate. MSG is a flavor enhancer, the sodium salt of glutamic acid, and amino acid naturally present in tomatoes, parmesan, mushrooms, and human breast milk. It was isolated from kelp in 1908 by a Japanese chemist named Kikunai Ikeda and has been produced commercially since. In April 1968, a physician named Dr. Robert Ho-Man Kwok published a letter in the New England Journal of Medicine describing symptoms he attributed to MSG in Chinese restaurant food. The term Chinese restaurant syndrome entered the culture and never quite left. Subsequent controlled studies have generally failed to confirm MSG as a specific trigger for the symptoms described, and the FDA has consistently classified MSG as GRAS. What the 1968 letter did accomplish, culturally, was to make MSG into a label shoppers actively read for, which is why in 1976 you would see not only MSG itself on labels, but also ingredient formulations designed to contribute glutamate without naming MSG. Hydrolyzed vegetable protein, autolyzed yeast extract, natural flavors. MSG remains legal. It remains controversial in public opinion more than in laboratory science, and the 1976 pantry is full of it under many names. Pattern interrupt. Notice how often the 1970s stories end not with a ban, but with a labeling change, a warning on saccharin, a mandatory listing of yellow no. 5. A trans fat disclosure on nutrition panels, a clearer statement of nitrite limits. The regulatory history of the 1970s pantry is, in large part, a history of disclosure, of making information visible so that shoppers could make their own decisions. The battles fought in that decade laid the groundwork for the nutrition labeling and Education Act of 1990, which created the standardized nutrition facts panel we all know today. 2 shelves to go. Reach for a bottle of Hawaiian Punch or a jar of fruit preserves or a bottle of soda. Read the label. You will likely find sodium benzoate, a preservative approved by the FDA since the early 20th century. Sodium benzoate is still widely used today. The specific concern that emerged later involved a chemical reaction. When sodium benzoate is combined with ascorbic acid, vitamin C under heat or light, trace amounts of benzene can form. Benzene is a known carcinogen. The FDA investigated this chemistry in the 1990s and again in the 2000s, found benzene levels in some beverages above drinking water standards, and worked with manufacturers to reformulate. Most major brands have reduced or eliminated the sodium benzoate plus ascorbic acid combination. The ingredient itself remains legal. The chemistry-specific problem was solved by reformulation rather than by a ban. That is another recurring pattern in American food law. The response targets the hazard, not the ingredient. Finally, reach for one more box. Any box. A cake, mix, a cookie package, a frozen pot pie, a macaroni dinner. Somewhere on the ingredient list, you will see the phrase artificial flavors or natural and artificial flavors and no further explanation. Flavor formulations have long been treated as proprietary trade secrets in the United States. A single phrase, artificial flavor, can represent dozens of individual chemical compounds blended by a flavor house to approximate strawberry, butter, vanilla, beef, smoke, or anything else. In 1976, the FDA's rules on flavor disclosure were minimal. They are only marginally more detailed today. The result is that the specific chemistry behind the synthetic strawberry tang of Quick, the butter yellow richness of movie popcorn topping, and the roast beef character of a bouillon cube is, even now, legally obscured. Shoppers who want to know exactly what is in natural flavor or artificial flavor generally cannot find out. Consumer advocates, including CSPI and Michael Jacobson, have pushed on this for decades. The disclosure wall has cracked here and there. Allergen listing rules in the 2000s forced some transparency, but it has not come down. Close the pantry. Step back. What you just walked through is not a horror show or a lost age of reckless chemistry. It is a snapshot of how a particular regulatory culture handled a particular set of industrial ingredients at a particular moment. Some were pulled. Red No. 2 in 1976, cyclamate in 1969, partially hydrogenated oils in 2018, brominated vegetable oil in 2024, Red No. 3 in food in 2025. Some were kept with restrictions. Sodium nitrite with mandatory ascorbate, Yellow No. 5 with specific labeling, saccharin with a warning label from 1977 to 2000. Some stayed, studied, and debated, but legally in place. BHA, BHT, Propyl, Galate, MSG, HFCS, sodium benzoate, potassium bromate at the federal level, and some have moved only at the state level, with California acting in 2023 and 2024 where the federal government has not. Here is what the 1976 pantry tells us about the present. Every ingredient disclosure law on the books in 2026 traces directly back to arguments first aired in the 1970s. The push to list color additives by name, the push to disclose specific allergens, the push to require a standardized nutrition facts panel, the push to put real ingredients rather than euphemisms on the front of the box. All of those fights began in the decade of Red No. 2 and saccharin warnings and Chinese restaurant syndrome letters. The names On those fights, Schmidt, Hutt, Ley, Nader, Jacobson, Choate are the names of the people who built the modern framework. It is a framework that is slow, decades slow. A dye can stay legal in food for 35 years after it has been banned in cosmetics. A preservative can sit on interim approval for 50 years before the paperwork catches up to the science. And yet, look at the before and after. The 1976 pantry and the 2026 pantry are meaningfully different. The colors are less lurid. The fats are different chemistry. The warning labels are specific rather than vague. The nutrition facts panel exists. The allergen disclosures exist. The work of the 1970s is visible on every shelf. Food law is slow, but it moves. And the 1976 pantry you just opened is the proof. So the next time you pick up a bottle of bright red soda, or a bag of bread, or a box of macaroni dinner, and you read the label, really read it, the way we just did together, you are using a tool that a previous generation fought to put in your hand. Somebody filed a petition. Somebody testified at a hearing. Somebody ran the rat study, published the letter, or demanded the disclosure. The pantry door you just closed is a working record of the long, slow, argumentative, stubbornly democratic process by which Americans decide what counts as food. Keep reading the labels. The next change is already being argued.